Where does the term toxic masculinity actually come from, and why is it that we're living in a universe where that's widespread and not hashtag toxic femininity?
I think there's a theory called the women are wonderful effect, which basically a theory that suggests that we associate good things to women and bad things to men. So they'll do stuff like they'll release 2 series of scientific papers, both are fake. One of them has positive things about men, like men are better leaders. The other one, same, but for women. Women are better leaders. And they'd give both papers to different subjects, and people routinely enjoyed the women's papers, but found the men's papers offensive and upsetting. And it's called the women are wonderful effect. So it's not hard to go from there to understand why we would never and should never label femininity as toxic. But the original concept of toxic masculinity, in my opinion, had some use to it. It came out of the Mythopoetic Men's movement in the 90s, which is basically a bunch of like hippie men that are all about like love and togetherness, especially fatherhood. They really believe in fatherhood and the power of fatherhood, as do I. And they felt toxic masculinity was basically what was left behind from absent fathering. And I find a lot of what they're saying, like Shepherd Bliss, who coined it, I find a lot of what they're saying useful. Like, that is actually useful, and it's completely antithetical to our current perspective of the problem, where we think masculinity is the problem. But for them, they felt masculinity was the solution. Like the lack of masculinity in these boys' lives was sort of shaping these behaviours. Like if you look at gangs, like classic toxic masculinity, knife crime in London, impossible not to talk about it. But so many of these boys come from fatherless homes. So I'm like, well, if so many of these boys come from fatherless homes, then is masculinity really the problem, or is it the lack of masculinity, or the lack of the right kind of masculinity? And is the solution more fatherhood, more healthy fatherhood, more masculinity? So yeah, toxic masculinity from the original concept, from the Mythopoetic Men's movement, changed now, just used as a catch-all slogan just to blame men quite literally for everything. Carol Harrington, who's a researcher, she went through and actually looked at studies of toxic masculinity, and she found more than half of them didn't even define what it was. Like, didn't even say what this thing was. It's just, in her words, it's used just to signal disapproval, just to attach men to as many bad things as possible. Toxic masculinity causes meat eating. Toxic masculinity causes knife crime. Toxic masculinity causes the climate crisis. Donald Trump, Brexit, the economic crash of 2007, not recycling, climate change. Absolutely ridiculous. How could something that caused Brexit also be causing men not to recycle? Like, it's obscene, and it doesn't mean anything, and it's not supposed to mean anything. It just signals disapproval.
But why is it that people keep on returning time and time again on these varied issues, from Trump to Brexit to toxic masculinity? What's in it for them? What's the incentive there?
Prestige, social currency, like looking good, virtue. Like they want to look good. They want to, like, this idea of, it's not just about correcting people's behavior. They want to be seen to correct people's behavior. Like Jonathan Haidt talks about this, and he had a complaint. He said something in a lecture and someone didn't like it. And instead of quietly talking to him afterwards, being, hey Jonathan, I sort of thought what we said was a bit inappropriate, and they could have a constructive conversation. They didn't say anything, and they went home and posted it on Facebook, and they made a massive big deal because they didn't really care, in my opinion. They just wanted to look like they care, and they wanted the prestige of taking his scalp, basically. And it's just about looking good. I don't think these people really care about any of these issues. They just want to stamp on men and look good doing it. That's been my experience. Because the work of actually understanding what shapes violence, such as fatherlessness, and we can go into more, is unpopular and very ugly. And like you said, there's no money to be made here. It's the ugly side of advocacy. And people don't want to do that. They want to just prance around talking about toxic masculinity and the patriarchy, which is just, who knows what you're on about. And they want to, it's not about doing good for them, it's about looking good. And I think that's what it's all about.
Well, let's delve into that. What is the current state of fatherlessness in the West?
I mean, in America, 1 in 4 boys is growing up without any male role model at home. So no father at all. So millions of boys, millions and millions. And then of those boys, they go to school, and in school, 80% of teachers are women. So only 1/5 of those boys have any male sort of role model. So there's millions and millions and millions and millions of boys. No role model at home, no father, no one at school, no primary male role model whatsoever. And if you actually look at that group, that's so overwhelmingly from that group come like perpetrators of violent crime, dropouts, people that die from suicide, people that are addicted to drugs, like everything bad can come from that group. Obviously not everyone that has no father is going to do those things, but you're disproportionately more likely to do those things if you come from that group. And like gangs, for example, like without a father, many boys go looking for family elsewhere, go looking for that role model elsewhere, leadership, but sense of belonging and purpose. So there's no father at home to give it to them. So they'll go out and find a family elsewhere. They'll pick up a knife and they'll go and join a gang. And gangs exploit those boys because they know they're vulnerable and they'll target them. And not just like gangs in London, but like things like ISIS. There've been studies of ISIS and they overwhelmingly targeted those boys. White supremacists, the same. If you look at school shooters, like such a high percent, like got to be over 90% of school shooters in America come from fatherless homes. And it's impossible to ignore. And I feel like we want to ignore it because it places the blame on single mothers, which I don't think is fair. I don't blame single mothers, but we do need to look at the importance of fathers in homes and the damage of not having fathers has without it blaming single mothers. And like, we can't shy away from that because it is a hard discussion. And fatherhood has just been like insulted and derided and diminished in the media by our politicians. My old local MP, Harriet Harman, horrible person, she wrote in a political paper that fatherhood isn't essential to harmonious family life. She wrote that down and used it to lobby government to remove fathers' rights in 1989. And I'm like, she is was a very senior politician, and she really did a lot to hurt fathers, both in writing and behind the scenes in legislation. And like, turn on the TV, like who's on in our cartoons, sitcoms, like you got Homer Simpson, you got Hal, you got Peter Griffin, like gone are the days of Mr. Rogers, who was a wonderful archetype of fatherhood and manliness. And now we've got these oafs. TV, like advertisements are different. Like the Advertising Standards Authority have now stepped in to stop brands from deriding fathers, hapless dads, oafs, to stop them actually now banning adverts because they just present dads as just completely inept. And it's, again, very antithetical because on one hand, we're asking fathers to do more, but on the other hand, we're insulting them. It's like, you can't ask for equal responsibility without equal respect and also equal rights. Like, fathers don't have equal rights in this country, and yet we're demanding them, they give us equal responsibility. But you can't have responsibility without rights. So my point is there's a lot missing from the conversation around fatherhood.
There's that cognitive dissonance of saying that men need to do more, but then that all male role models are toxic and a bad influence.
Yeah. Or like, men can talk, but then you talk about things like male victims of abuse, and then you're told to shut up. Or like, well, I want to talk about experiences of abuse. I want to talk about experiences of sexual violence towards men. And they can't talk about that. Incel, shut up. The misogynist, this isn't about you, this is about women. The amount of times I've been told to shut up whilst also being told to talk. I'm like, if I'm going to talk, I'll talk about what I choose, and you don't get to decide what I talk about, nor do other men. Like recently, I was contacted by someone who follows me called Rory, who tried to set up a men's network at Loughborough University, and the Students' Union were very on board with it because male students are twice at risk of suicide as female students. Boys are behind at every stage of education. Men are at really high risk of drug addiction, alcohol. Anyway, a men's group to discuss these things. SU was on board, great. Got announced, like a literal space for men to talk, and the backlash was unbelievable. I've never seen anything quite like it. The comments were outrageous. And that's when I'm like, those are the people I'm afraid of. I'm glad they've not found me. But it was hostile, so hostile, and they actually cancelled the whole thing before it even started for fears of the physical safety of Rory. Like, they were actually afraid of him. And I'm like, that's an extremist political group on campus. And that's the problem. What Rory's doing is great and it might actually save lives. Apart from it won't, because it's cancelled. Like, the problem is the extremist political group making threats. Like, you would not do that. If there was like someone making threats towards like the gay society, you would not cancel the gay society. You would like get those people off of campus, get the police involved, maybe. And like, it's not an isolated matter. I know of one similar thing where they went into primary schools to educate boys, and they got closed down on the charge of domestic terrorism because what they were doing to boys was considered domestic terrorism. What they were basically going in and spreading propaganda, brainwashing boys in the opposite way to Andrew Tate, who's also brainwashing boys, but they were brainwashing boys in the opposite ways. You're a rapist in waiting. You're a man. You're an oppressor. And they no longer exist because they were closed down. And I was like, that is a bold charge. And I sort of agree with it. And at what point is it domestic terrorism to shout down these societies and deprive men and boys of the very thing that might actually save their lives? Like, fact is, the greatest risk to your life and my life and your life over there is suicide. You wake up tomorrow, same again, every single day until you're 50. one of the best ways of combating suicide is friendship, networks, men's spaces. But those are the very things that are being shouted down. So it's like, not only do you have to deal with suicide, the threat of suicide, but the very thing that might actually serve as an antidote to that very problem is also being taken away, and you're an incel if you don't like that. So yeah, it makes your head spin, to be honest.